This time, I sit down with Jerry Rothwell, a documentary filmmaker who has made award-winning films like Town of Runners, How to Change the World, Heavy Load, and most recently, The Reason I Jump. The Reason I Jump is based on the best-selling book written by Naoki Higashida, a non-speaking autistic Japanese boy. The film weaves Naoki's writings around stories of non-speaking autistic people across the globe, immersing the audience in their unique sensory worlds full of intensity, richness, and beauty, and sometimes shadows and terror. As I watched the film, I was blown away by the insights into the world of the non-speaking autistic people on screen. The part about civil rights was especially moving. In this episode, Jerry and I get into the challenges of making a film centered around non-speaking people, the unique way the audio was recorded, the film's display of nature and other sensory environments, Jerry's journey as a filmmaker, and more. Without further ado, please enjoy this deep dive with Jerry Rothwell. All right, so Jerry Rothwell, thank you for joining me today on the All About Kids podcast.
Hi, Zach. Good to be here.
I thought a good place to start, and this is actually perfect because I see you have Heavy Load in the background, the artwork from one of your previous documentaries. I wanted to start with sort of an overall approach to some of the documentaries you've made, like How to Change the World, which is on the founders of Greenpeace. You have Town of Runners, which is about two Ethiopian girls in a village trying to make it as athletes. You have Heavy Load, which is a group of people with disabilities who form a punk band. And then, of course, The Reason I Jump, which we'll get into today, which follows a group of non-speaking people with autism as they navigate the world. And for you, you seem to gravitate towards telling the stories of the people who may be forgotten about or less thought about or aren't able to speak for themselves. And what draws you to telling those type of stories? Because there's billions of stories you could literally tell with a camera. What draws you and has drawn you to those types of stories in particular?
Yeah, I mean, maybe. I mean, it's sort of a huge range, I guess, of subject matter of from wine fraud to Greenpeace to punk bands to non-speaking autism. I guess for me, like a documentary is always sort of a search. It's a search process that it's got to be something that you're genuinely interested in finding out about it, and you find out about it during the shooting and making process, and it's what you find out about it that essentially you kind of bring to an audience. I don't kind of believe in docs where you script them in advance and then all you're doing is kind of making the thing that you've written. And I guess those subject matters, I don't know. I mean, I think often, like when I finished a film, whatever the last film was about, I kind of veer to something very dissimilar to it, So when I finished the film about the founders of Greenpeace, the next film was about a wine fraudster, which is like as far away as you could get really from the anti-whaling campaigns of the 1970s. And I think that was just like, so this idea was knocking around, someone brought this idea and it was like, oh yeah, okay, I'd really like, I can see that. I think I need to sort of see the shape of a film to take it on. Let's have a sense of how it, where the turning points are, how it might unfold, but be willing to sort of change depending on what we find.
Yeah, so a good documentary approach, a good documentarian, it seems like would follow some sort of similar approach to scientific approach or scientific method, because if you start an experiment and you're trying to get the predetermined outcome, then you might find yourself altering his result or altering the way that things pan out in the individual experiments to fit the overall narrative that you want to tell. And so making a documentary, a good documentary is kind of like that, it sounds like, where you have a story in mind that you're wanting to tell, but you're open to changing based on what you see or based on the evidence and based on how things pan out when you're filming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's good to start with a question rather than the message, that you kind of, there's something about a story which which is why it kind of grabs you. It's the complex bit of it that you want to unfold and uncover. I think that's for me what's really important.
What was the question that you had in your mind for The Reason I Jump before you started filming, before you maybe even made plans for the documentary? What was the question that popped into your head that you felt a desire to answer or find some sort of greater meaning?
So, I mean, its starting point is this book by this 12-year-old Japanese boy in a Tokyo suburb who's, I guess, just at that age where he's starting to realize that perhaps, we all have this at 12 years old, that we're not the person that everyone else thinks we are, we're ourselves. Sort of thing. And in his case, it's kind of realizing that the world thinks of him as autistic and what that means. And so he, the book in a way is him asking lots of questions about that, and trying to anticipate the questions others ask. So, one of them is, why do I jump? And that's why the book's called The Reason I Jump. For me, it was what was striking about the book was that it conveyed this really sensory world, this very sensory experience in which images and sounds and vibrant colors and details and patterns and oscillations were things that Naoki described as kind of a world that he became immersed in to the exclusion of the context around it. And I kind of wondered, how true that was for other non-speaking autistic people. I wanted to make the film kind of global so that we went to a number of different people around the world. And also, I guess for me, there was an interesting question about how could you make something that's like a cinematic equivalent of the book. So it's not really an adaptation, because the book is like a 58 questions and answers. Mm-hmm. It's got no plot, no character. But how could you make something that did the same job as the book does, which is take you into a very different experience of reality?
Yeah, one of the questions, one of the questions that was a narrated passage in the movie, because like you said, it's based on the book written by Naoki, but he doesn't actually appear on film, but he does have narrated passages of what he wrote in the book, The Reason I Jump. One of those passages in the beginning said, can you imagine how your life would be if you couldn't say what you wanted? And that was a common theme for me throughout the film, is that I'm watching this group of people that are non-speaking autistic, and they obviously have similar desires and wants and needs to the rest of us, and they're getting this input from the rest of the world, and there's this gap between those desires and needs and what they're able to communicate in neurotypical terms, and the world is built in a neurotypical fashion. So if you want to buy a sandwich, or you want to say that you love this work of art, or you want to create you want to create almost anything, if it's not in neurotypical terms, it can be hard for people to understand. And it's still hard for me to understand, because I don't have autism. I'm able to speak. And that was a common theme for me, is how vividly and how deeply this group of people feels things, and I can see a lot of parts of myself, similar desires, similar things that I want to do in this film.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots for everyone to identify in it. I mean, that's for me, one of the learning experiences of the film was to think a bit about how I kind of process reality, and how actually we all maybe do it with different kind of biases and in a slightly different ways, and how interesting that is in terms of the way we communicate with each other. But I guess that thing about not being able to say what you're thinking is, you see a lot of frustration in the young people in the film. I think there's a kind of a real desire to not to be spoken for, or not to have the things that you want kind of just overridden because you can't speak. And we live in a very verbal world, I think, where if you don't speak, people think that you're stupid and you don't think. I mean, we really shouldn't think that, given, you know, someone like Stephen Hawking kind of, and you had to use a device to speak in his later life, and clearly
Yeah.
was someone who could think some pretty sophisticated thoughts. So it's kind of, yeah, I think I think we often, neurotypically, we often judge people just by their exterior and by what they say.
Yeah. The film did make me realize how much we have an attachment to speaking, and speaking as a symbol of intelligence or competence, because there are many people who are competent at certain skills that may not be able to speak in a, you know, this intoxicating or vivid manner and clear, cogent manner in the way that we are used to it. And there are people also that don't have great skills but are able to speak their way into making you believe that they do. And so it's like we take this small slice of a person's life, which is the verbal communication, and we kind of extrapolate that to the broader sense of is this, you know, a competent human being in general? Is this a smart human being in general?
Yeah, and I think kind of historically for non-speaking autistics, they've been assumed to be incompetent. You know, and there's this thing in that world now of saying, you know, presume competence, presume that someone can understand what you're saying. You know, that sort of thing of people kind of talking in front of people, making assumptions about you know. There's that great bit in Naoki's book that's in the film where he says, you know, people say, oh yeah, he just likes to be on his own, but actually I'm kind of desperate to be with other people, but my interactions with other people so often go wrong that it's kind of easier to stay to the side.
Are there any interesting challenges or surprises that you had as a filmmaker that came up when you're creating a documentary around people who are non-speaking? Anything that you weren't expecting, or the approach to the film where you had to take a certain approach this time as opposed to if you had 5 subjects that were able to speak?
I mean, I think like the first challenge was that Naoki didn't want to be in the film. You know, he was really happy for the project to go ahead, but I think that idea that the film might be about this young Japanese boy finding his voice and becoming a writer, you know, that kind of went out the window. But actually, that sent it in a more interesting direction, I think. And in a way, it's a real gift to a filmmaker. I learned so much about filmmaking doing this film because I had to be less reliant on plot or on words or on explanations. You know, it was very much a kind of show, don't tell approach. You know, I think the film sort of tries to sit you alongside the characters who you meet, the people who you meet, and to maybe experience the environments they're in a kind of sensory way rather than just as a sort of background. But it's also not. I don't think film can get you into someone else's head completely. You know, it's not a simulation. It's not like I hope people don't come out going, "Oh, right, that's how it is to be autistic." Apart from anything else, you know, autistic experience is this huge range of different experiences, and you can even see that in the 5 people in the film. Just huge differences between them. But yeah, it was an exciting challenge, and I think I kind of learned a lot about filmmaking, about the use of sound and association, things you often don't let yourself do in a film, like sometimes the associative edit, you know, the edit of something which is just motivated by its associative link to something else, which is wrong for another film because you're not following that plot line, you know, you're not moving it on in that way. It was absolutely right for this film, and it needed a different kind of shape.
Yeah, I imagine that presents a lot of difficulties when so much of the film is centered around the sensory approach and the sensory experience of people who are non-speaking autistic, and these 5 people specifically. And one part of the film that stands out in particular is the rain scene when Naoki is describing how he has to go through this whole process in his head to identify that it's raining, that he hears certain things and he sees certain things, and to where a neurotypical person, you brain just kind of automatically puts those things together and groups them, and it's rain. He has to sort of hand pick each thing that's going on and make sense of it in real time. There's like this whole extra layer that goes on in his head that is dedicated with energy. Like, it takes energy, it seems like, to do this all day. And for something as simple as rain, that scene where it starts out soft and then it gradually picks up, and then it seems like the sound changes to where it's super harsh and almost sounds like tacks on the table, in a sense. What was kind of your approach to creating scenes like that to people that are not used to hand-picking sensory experience in real time, and kind of showing what it's like for Naoki and the other 5 people in the film?
I mean, so we decided early on to make the film in 360-degree sound and Atmos sound mix, which enables you to place a sound in 128 different places in a cinema.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like this very immersive experience, and I think probably that's what most of all gives the film an immersive feel. And for example, for that sequence, I worked with sound designer Nick Ryan, who's himself synesthetic, as a lot of non-speaking autistics are, and has also done a lot of artwork around the sort of neuroscience of hearing and listening. And for that sequence, Naoki says this thing about flipping through when he hears rain. He describes a moment of hearing rain and needing to flip through all of his memories of rain in order to establish and link the sound of rain to the idea that it's raining. Which is, like, for a neurotypical person, is a really difficult idea to get your head around. And for that sequence, we happened to have shot one of the characters on the balcony in a high-rise in India when the storm is rolling in. And Nick kind of designed it. We used the 360 sound of that rain, and also whenever we were on the shoot and it rained, we just kind of recorded as much rain as possible. So that sequence, first of all, includes the 360 from that moment, but also the resonances of other rain. And then Nick kind of layered on top of that sounds that weren't rain, but sound like rain, the crinkling of paper or the dropping of drawing pins on a table. And I think the effect of that on an audience is to be watching something and what you're hearing is not quite what you're seeing, but is kind of triggering associations. And so maybe it puts people into a place where they're sort of seeing something, not just maybe as the neurotypical way we'd filter it, sound of rain, that's rain, those two things go together, but instead links it to the memories of other things and other moments.
Yeah, for me, when I was watching it, I heard the rain, and then when it started to get stronger, I got the sense that the sound of the rain is the most overwhelming experience for me at the moment. And in my own head, I was thinking, if this is anything like what the characters go through, not the characters, the people that go through in the movie, in the film, that there's like this way of senses capturing you, and they become overwhelming in the moment. And I can only imagine, being in a rainstorm for an hour straight and being fixated on a certain aspect, as the sound or the sight. And I feel like that scene gave me at least a small peek into how senses can be, beautiful and also disturbing or overwhelming at the same time, depending on where you're at.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the sort of intensity that Naoki describes. This thing where at times it's phenomenally, he can see the phenomenal beauty or the pattern of something, and at times it's so overwhelming that it's hard to listen to. I filmed with some people that aren't in the film, but one of the things that he found really hard was air dryers in toilets. That sudden sound where there's this intense boom, and it would be incredibly sort of disturbing, frightening, anxious making for him. Partly, I think, because it was unexpected. Like you didn't know when someone was going to, if you're in a public toilet and a washroom, and someone kind of triggered the hand dryer, you had no kind of control over when that incredibly disruptive sound would happen. So yeah, I think it's both enormously beautiful and potentially enormously anxiety making.
So how did the stories of these 5 people come together for the movie? Where did you meet them? How did you link up, and how did that connection happen to where they decided that they wanted to appear in the film?
Yeah, I mean, mostly we kind of found people through either sort of word of mouth contacts or sometimes through the internet, and then kind of we'd, for example, Amrit, the artist in India, she started painting at the age of, I think, or started drawing at the age of 4. She's nonverbal, and drawing was a way for her to describe her day to her mum, and this is what's happened to me today. And that's now turned, she's now 22, and it's turned into this incredibly sort of productive artwork, sort of huge canvases, very vibrant colours, sort of huge details of people's faces, and of kind of the things she sees on the street. So that felt like a really good place to start the film, because it takes you literally into another way of seeing. And I guess that's what you want to do at the beginning of the film, is to kind of just shift people to the side of where they're usually at and think in a different way. And then I suppose that one of the decisions that we only really came to in the edit was, were we going to intercut all these people, or were we going to have sections of the film where you spend a lot of time with them and then you move on, and maybe what you've learned from the last person you take on to the next person. And we sort of decided to do the latter, to do it in kind of sections. So the next person you visit is Joss, and the sequence with Joss, who's a young adolescent boy going through, I think, a period of a lot of intense sort of over sensory stimulation, finding life quite difficult. And his sequence is a lot about sort of time and memory, and the kind of ways that Naoki describes his memory as unlike maybe the more linear neurotypical memory, as one that's arranged like a pool of dots, and at any moment a dot can rise to the surface and kind of capture him. And then I wanted to give the film a more sort of political advocacy turn, and so I found Ben and Emma in the States, who both write in the way Naoki writes, using a letterboard or an iPad. Yeah. But also a part of a sort of civil rights movement for autistic people. And then finally the film ends in Sierra Leone. I was already shooting in Sierra Leone on another film, and was just interested in how autism played out in an African context. Yeah. And that's how we found Mary and Justina.
So you thought it would be more powerful to have each story told one after the other, rather than kind of intertwine and cut back and forth?
Yeah, because I think the film has a sort of shape and a forward motion, but doesn't have a plot, So you're not necessarily leaving people on sort of cliffhangers to which you can return. Yeah. You can't get that kind of tension in it. The tension in the film is about this gradual unfolding of you realizing how these different people are experiencing the world, and so that I think required you to spend time with each of them. Yeah, I'd seen a film. I don't know if you've seen the documentary Camera Person by Kirsten Johnson, but I haven't. That's structured. That's structured in that episodic way, and I just thought it kind of works beautifully. And I guess it's quite an unconventional way of structuring a film, especially a doc. But yeah, it felt like the right way to go. Yeah.
So we spoke about the 360 sound, which is incredible. I wanted to get into the visual approach a little bit for how you shot the film. And another passage in the film that Naoki writes is he talks about the whole image floating into focus, and there are multiple times throughout the film where you are watching, eggs frying or rain or grass, things in nature, to get that feeling of things coming in and out of focus and seeing the details first, and then the kind of the whole expanding onto the whole picture. What was your approach visually for the film? How did you translate? How did you get from the camera to making that effect possible on screen.
So yeah, I mean, I worked with a young DOP, Ruben Woodin Deschamps, and he wasn't typically a documentary DOP, although he'd done some docs, but more he made music videos, kind of short dramas, experimental work, and I kind of wanted an approach to it that was different, maybe from the kind of being on auto for documentaries. And I suppose we took kind of hints from Naoki's writing and from the writing of other non-speaking autistics. Naoki, as I said this thing about detail and the immersion in detail, and there's this layer in the film which is about using macro close-ups just in the environments that we find people, not kind of superimposing special effects on it, but just what we would find in these places. And it's a bit like that game you used to get in like kids magazines where it's like you'd see a hyper close up of something and it would say kind of what is this, and then on the next page it'd be revealed that it's a matchbox or it's a radiator or whatever. So that I think so there was an element of that kind of hyper detail layer. There's then quite a kind of sat back observational layer where we're just hanging out with people in their everyday lives and getting to know them, I suppose, through that. And maybe they're doing something, maybe they're making a painting, maybe they're training for an ice hockey match, or maybe they're going to the beach. And that was very much about trying to create an intimacy. We went with a really small crew, just me, a DOP, a sound recordist, and then there'd be a camera assistant who was often kind of not near the action. And just spending time with people, really, to get those moments. And I guess the film is made up of all these little small moments. And then there's a third layer in the film, which is, I think, there because we didn't want the people in the film, the contributors who you visit, to be there, to feel like they're sort of case studies of the book, or they're only there to illustrate things that are in the book. So we felt that you needed something visual that was a place where a lot of the book could happen, and we've wanted people to think about Naoki and the writer of the book in those moments. So we found this young non-speaking Japanese boy in the UK, Jim Fujiwara, and essentially shot him on a kind of journey through a set of landscapes, and you could interpret that. The journey's not really interpreted in the film. It could be a journey from the sea to the city, from night to day, from day to night, or evening to night, or home. But it's basically a kind of, it's also a journey of self-discovery, maybe. And that we decided to shoot in a very kind of kinetic way. So unlike the more sort of static documentary stuff, we used a stabilization and kind of followed Jim through these environments and kind of just really, were with him as he was observing these new places.
Yeah, there were a bunch of beautiful nature and landscape shots in the film, and I felt I felt a little bit of what is talked about in the film about nature, where if you can't speak and you can't communicate with other people in a neurotypical way, nature is not only beautiful to you, but it's also something that is there for you, like an embrace. Naoki talks about it when nothing else is there for him in the world, nature is always there for me, and I don't have to say anything, I don't have to do anything, I can just kind of sit and feel it with the senses. And I feel like those type of shots really gave me the feeling of there's nothing else but nature here. It's not just the beauty aspect, it made me think about the really how beautiful nature can be when nothing else is around.
Yeah, and a kind of a place, I think Naoki describes nature as for him it's a place where there are no expectations of him. There's no kind of human demands, requirements to be a certain way, communicate a certain way. The book actually ends with this story, which I didn't include in the film, but I think it was sort of the genesis of that idea of the young lad going through these landscapes. And in the story, Naoki writes about a boy called Shun who's knocked over by a car and dies, but doesn't realize that he's dead, and then kind of travels first of all to look at his he sees his grieving parents through the window and doesn't understand why they're so upset, and gradually he realizes he must have died, and he starts then to travel the world as a sort of spirit. And I think in some ways that story is about, actually it's not about sort of death, it's about the freedom of being liberated from the body. I think for many autistic people, or at least for Naoki in the book, he talks about feeling that his body is this faulty robot that never does what he wants it to do, and that story is of like, what might life be like if you were just free of the body, and in a way maybe that's a bit carried in this kid going through the landscapes, that he's almost like this kind of this spirit world sort of envoy that David Mitchell, the translator, talks about in the film.
That's something that I also took away from the film that I didn't realize before. There's such a mechanical aspect to autism where it's not, it's not the intelligence, it's not the competence in many cases. It's there's literally, it seems like this mechanical glitch and processing thing going on in the body where you have the signal within you have the thing you want to say, you have the movement you want to do, you have the emotion you want to express, and then there's this thing going on in your nervous system or in your brain that I don't completely understand, but we're doing a lot of work to figure this out, is what is that mechanism that is not working the way that it's supposed to, or not working the way it would in a neurotypical person. And that in the film was something that I really strongly got, is the mechanical aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes when you're with Joss in the film, you just feel that discomfort, his discomfort in his own body, or feeling. I can't remember which writer, one of the non-speaking writers, talks about being able to kind of feel like his skull as a sort of presence, and that thing of feeling, and maybe the neurotypical brain kind of, in the way it orientates us in space and makes us think of ourselves as a coherent sort of self that's acting in the world, filters out a lot of that stuff. But now he certainly kind of writes about it, and it does make you think about what how on earth do we manage to exist in the world in the way that we do?
Something I wanted to ask you: has anyone in the psychedelic community reached out to you about the film? Because I've watched a few psychedelic documentaries, that I've listened to a bunch of podcasts on psychedelics, and people do use similar language to describe a lot of the things that Naoki writes, where there's this kind of this blasting of the senses when you're on a mushroom trip or an LSD trip, where the capacities you have to make sense of the different inputs going on in your body get kind of just washed away in this powerful wave, and you're not able to communicate things in a way that you normally would. And it's definitely, it's not, I'm not saying that they're the same experience or they're the same in any way. I have noticed an association between some of the language people use to describe a psychedelic experience, and some of the language that's in the movie about sensory control and speaking and experiencing things in ways that may be in a similar vein to like a temporary psychedelic experience. So I was curious if anyone in that community reached out to you and was like, hey, this kind of sounds like maybe something similar is going on there.
I think there are definitely touch points where those things there are similarities in the things people describe completely. I agree. And I guess long ago my psychedelic experiences would be something that I think probably helped me make the film, in the sense that you would what it looks like to look at the ceiling and feel like it rippling and vibrating, or those kinds of experiences. There's a great book called Autism and the Edges of the Unknown World, I think it's called, by this British academic, and she writes about that about the connection between psychedelic experiences and autistic experiences. So I
Oh,
think there
really?
is, yeah, I think there
Aut-
is, yeah, I think there is.
it's called Autism and the
I
Unknown
think it's,
World.
I've got it on the shelf over there.
I can
Autism,
always look it up too and put it in
yeah,
the description.
autism and the edges of the known world.
Yeah. I
Um,
I think that my previous psychedelic experiences and also meditation was running in the background and allowed me to connect more deeply to what people were describing and experiencing on film, because such a strong part of meditation or psychedelic experiences is kind of tapping into one sense, and some parts are super overwhelming, and some parts are blissful, disturbing. You kind of go on this journey, and there may be something there where the future of psychedelics and the future of autism treatment can help each other out and combine. That'll be an interesting thing to see going forward.
There are lots of ways in which our kind of waking neurotypical state kind of grounds or filters experiences, which are then are kind of
Yeah, they're like blown to pieces.
removed in various neurological conditions and in psychedelic experiences.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, I don't know about treatments. I guess there's a kind of ethical, interesting ethical dilemma.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there a favorite scene that you have that you didn't include in the film? Maybe something for time, or maybe it didn't fit with the narrative that you portrayed in the final version, but on its own was a super powerful scene. Is there anything that comes to mind that you didn't include that was still in your mind a moving scene?
It's quite. I mean, I've been done some work kind of with a group of student postgraduate editors to explore like a non-verbal version of the film, one that's completely kind of non-verbal and just actually musical using the score. And there's a lot of material that we shot that can be used in that way. I mean, I guess my sort of the biggest sort of section that we didn't include was with the sort of sixth character, the sixth person that we filmed with, which is a young lad called Corey in Glasgow, who was in a young non-verbally autistic boy in a play in a theatrical version of the book, and that sequence was great. And I was kind of to begin with sort of thinking about, well, there's a really interesting thing that happens there between someone being interpreting the book within the film. In the end, we kind of lost it because it felt like you couldn't have these two organizing concepts for the film. You start to get confused about, well, was the book a book, or is it a play, or is it so we had to lose a lot of that material, which was a great regret, and I'd kind of love to still try and do something with that.
Yeah, so it was going to be working on some sort of version that would have no words at all, kind of just following them.
Yeah. I mean, I'm still we've probably cut about half of it. Whether it'll ever kind of surface, I don't know. But it's an exciting experiment. I mean, one of the things I think I realized in cutting that was actually the words do give us, where there are words, these little nudges from the parents and also from the book itself, obviously, they're pretty important in shaping the way we look at those very immersive visual sequences, and actually once you lose them, I think the whole thing loses something. So.
Something that I wasn't expecting when I was watching the film is how captivating the letterboard scenes would be, because if you told me that a big portion of the film was going to be someone spelling out what they wanted to say on a letterboard, I would be like, I don't want to wait that long to hear what someone's going to say. And then for those scenes, I was on the edge of my seat, like waiting to hear, waiting to see what Ben was going to say, what other people were going to say in the film using the letterboard. And I guess for you, what was there anything interesting you came away with from the letterboard experience and seeing how they used it? Anything that stands out from being alongside them while they're spelling things out?
I mean, I think it is a really compelling process, and one dilemma in the film was, do we put that up front, or is actually it doesn't kind of happen until about an hour into the film, which I think means that when it does happen, it's like, whoa, hold on a minute, what's happening there? And we had this sort of graphic technique which David Sharp, the editor, came up with, where you just put the letters out in a long line and then they resolve so that you really only get what's being said at the end. Mm-hmm. Or maybe you're working it out as you're watching it. I mean, it's a really extraordinary thing to witness, and that it's something there's been a lot of skepticism around, because in the 1990s, there's this technique called facilitated communication that became very big, where people's arms were supported as they pointed to a letterboard, and that under kind of test conditions, not that test conditions are necessarily great for non-speaking autistic people. Mm-hmm. A lot of those communications were seen to come from the facilitator rather than from the person themselves. Mm-hmm. But in the film, Naoki himself kind of doesn't use that method. Nobody really uses that method in the film. And it was very clear to me, when you see Naoki type on his own on a computer or pointed to a letterboard, the book clearly he's clearly capable of writing the book. And the same with Ben. We tried to leave those sequences quite long, so that it didn't feel like we were just kind of cutting around them in order to kind of make sense of them. So you get the mistakes people are making, and you kind of see what the amount of concentration it takes to do that. And I'm always struck by like sometimes some of the complexity of the language that people are using, the word paradigm, or
Yeah, and you can see the building blocks are there for quicker conversations, because for people who haven't seen the film, when we're talking about a letterboard, it's literally a cutout board with letters. There's no electronics or anything like that transferring to the screen. They use electronics in the film to do other things, but you could see how once that if that technology became better and you were able to pass something like that you could carry around with you to non-speaking autistic people, like it even had words or phrases or common sentences, and just allowed you to put things together much more quickly, that you could have a normal paced and like a neurotypically paced conversation, even though you weren't able to speak.
Yeah, and I think that, there are a huge range of other kind of devices. It's a use of symbols. Jim largely uses this symbol system to give the little boy who's in the film to communicate. Ben prefers that letterboard that you can kind of stick the pencil through the hole, partly because of the physicality of it, I think. There's a moment in the film where Emma uses an iPad that types out to a screen. Corey, who I was just talking about, uses an iPad and then uses it, switches it to voice mode, so he'll type a sentence and then press the voice, and that enables a really kind of good interchange in conversation. So yeah, it's really exciting. I think it's the possibilities of those things.
Was it a challenge for you to figure out what speaking moments to put in the film? Because even though the people are technically non-speaking, they are saying some words and some sounds. But the film makes clear that just because a non-speaking autistic person says something, that's not always intentional. Sometimes it's a word or noise that doesn't have something to do with what they're trying to communicate. So how did you navigate that? If maybe you thought something was intentional or it wasn't, or maybe it was an intentional thing.
Yeah, there's obviously the speech of parents and families in the film, and I tried to kind of keep that fairly minimal. I think often films about non-speaking autistic people are told entirely through the parents' experience, and the parents' experience has a particular shape. They had a child, they discovered the child was autistic, that made them have to change their perceptions. It's full of challenges, and that's not obviously the autistic person's story, which is a really different thing. I'm born, here I am, kind of thing. Instead. So I've tried to sort of minimize that, but they're absolutely a part of everyone's life, and they are there and they are important there. In terms of the sort of speech used by autistic people in the film, I think that the first time we really come across that, I kind of used this bit from Naoki in the book, where he talks about sometimes kind of words tumbling out that might be associations or memories or something that he's almost got stuck on as a phrase, which sometimes is frustrating, I think, back to that body as a faulty robot thing, but sometimes also can be a form of communication itself, so he talks about it as like exchanging a favorite phrase with someone as being like a game of catch. And there's a bit in the film where Joss uses, he goes, "Is it a red Hoover?" And the kind of response he's kind of grown to like from that is, "No, it's a black Hoover."
Yeah.
To which he'll say, "Is it a black Hoover?" And the person goes, "No, it's a red Hoover."
Yeah.
And then this black Hoover, red Hoover, and it's got this amazing kind of rhythm to it. It actually refers to a memory of a swimming pool cleaner that he saw on holiday once when he was, I think, 5 or 6 years old or younger even, a red thing that collected leaves off a swimming pool. So it's like it's something that's a past memory, but it's kind of got locked into language in a completely different functional way. And I tried to just use that in ways that people would start to think about and understand those forms of communication, which are still communication, they're not necessarily intentional.
Yeah. The memory part of the film, especially with Joss, that was a fascinating aspect where memories are usually thought of as these linear experiences where you can call upon them when you want to, but when you do call upon them, it's clear that this is something that got your attention 10 years ago or 5 years ago, and the length of time that has passed between you and the experience is built into the memory, whereas for someone in the film, one of who may be a non-speaking autistic person, something that they may experience is that a memory, it's not clear that the impact of a memory is tied to how long ago it happened. They can experience something just as strongly or feel something just as strongly that happened 10 years ago as 10 minutes ago, and that sensation and the sensory experiences tied to the memory can fly right back into the present, and it's not this clear linear path.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it brings the sort of emotional force of the original memory with it. I guess a lot of us have that with smell, I think. I think there's times when you can smell something and it will immediately recall something that might be a long time ago. And maybe less so with, say, language or seeing a pattern, that might not necessarily trigger in the. But I think, it's interesting that I think all of these states are like fundamental human states. They're not, they're not confined to autistic people. Which is this thing Donna Williams, the autistic writer, says, we all visit these states. It's just that the difference of being autistic is you live there, and that's a very different experience, from the occasional.
Yeah, we can visit it temporarily. I've had some experiences like that with smell where I've been walking around and I smell a perfume from maybe it's a same perfume of someone I dated 5 years ago, and I'll smell that and all these memories will come flooding back. Or sometimes with music, I'll be walking across the Brooklyn Bridge listening to music, and then I hear a song where I heard it the first time down at University of Richmond, where I went to school in Virginia, and I'll kind of be transported back to walking outside the library, because for whatever reason that memory is tied the most strongly to that song I listened to. So I've definitely had experiences like that where I'm kind of temporarily transported back to another memory like it just happened.
Yeah, I think definitely it's it's common to all of us. Maybe it's about the level of intensity of it and the regularity of it.
Is there a part of the film that you think personally changed you the most, where you look back to that specific 5 minutes and you think this is affecting the way that I am walking through the world, maybe more so than other parts of the film? Because for me, I felt like the civil rights scene where Ben says they've denied us our civil rights, that was, along with the other parts of the film that were conveying the sensory aspects of what people, what the five people are going through. This was kind of like a meta realization where I can express my civil rights because we live in a world that expects me to express them in a neurotypical fashion where I say them out loud, and I say when something's wrong or I say when something's right. And that was kind of like, you can't even, if you're being denied them, how are you even supposed to say that? Is there any film,
I think that actually
anything
that,
like that?
same moment, I think that moment does the same for me. I think partly because I think at that moment you are really aware of how you have judged people in the past and how you have sort of disregard, or interpreted lack of speech as lack of thought. And I think it's a moment that sort of turns the tables on the audience really, and makes you really question the way that you've looked at people. It was interesting when we first cut that moment. We cut away from Ben doing the letterboard to images of other kind of civil rights struggles for equality, and to try and link the quest for autistic rights to those other struggles. And in the end, we kind of cut all of that because we just felt it's like you need to just sort of be there, and you'll make those associations anyway. I think that was one of the kind of learning the lessons of the film really was how to kind of just step back a bit and let an audience make the links rather than push them on them.
I was tearing up a little bit on that scene, and then the teacher also, when it panned back to her, it looked like she was also getting emotional, and it was a very powerful scene because it made me think about all the times in my life where I thought I wasn't being treated well, and maybe someone was doing something to me that they didn't have my consent for, and I express hey, you can't do this, this is wrong, or I want you to stop this right now, or maybe I'm enjoying this, I want to experience this again, and you're not even the way the world is set up. I can do that very easily, and there's not that path right now for non-speaking autistic people where they can clearly communicate when their rights are being violated in a situation right then and there, and for the other person to be able to understand what they're saying.
Yeah, and I think, historically, non-speaking autistic people have on the whole been kind of banished, made to live quite invisible lives in institutions and so on. And it's kind of it is really heartening that people like Ben and Emma, and there's a whole movement now to make sure that, or that's trying to make sure that voice is heard in kind of the way society responds to non-speaking autistics. I really hope the film draws people into that and makes people listen to that movement more.
What was your experience like filming down in Sierra Leone? Because that was an aspect that was so clearly different from the other parts of the film. It's the way that people thought about autism down there and neurological differences in general. People talking about throwing autistic children in rivers, or just dumping them because there's some sort of demonic thing going on or something like that. What was it like to be in that sort of environment and film the experiences going down in Sierra Leone?
I always thought of that sequence as being where the film kind of broadens out to think not just about the autistic individual, but about the society that they're in. And so that sequence also does contain these kind of references to the Nazi T4 program, which killed autistic kids, or to the ways kids, autistic people have been institutionalized, or the whole idea of kind of euthanasia. I don't think it's not a specifically African issue. It's an issue across a lot of societies. But I think what I was just really struck by was Mary, Justina's mum's work, Mary's work, and how one individual or a family could have a really great impact. They're doing these kind of workshops in mainly rural communities where there's very strongly held beliefs about disabled people being in some way the progeny of the devil, or particularly autistic people, with the consequence that there's a strong social pressure to abandon autistic children. And but also, really struck by the families and the mothers of those kids absolutely being the point of resistance to that. They're the ones that are already kind of resisting that community pressure. And Mary's support for that and her kind of interventions in that, I think have saved a lot of lives. And setting up the kind of school that she's done, which was the first school for autistic young people in Freetown in Sierra Leone, I think has had a big impact on government policy, on the way people think about autism. So it's hopefully it's as well as being like shocking at times in that sequence, and I think we kind of cut out actually a lot of the more shocking material that we shot. It's a kind of hopeful. I think it's a hopeful sort of sequence.
Yeah, it gives you a good perspective on, before you even try to address the problem of improving the quality of life for people who are non-speaking autistic, you have to make people understand and help them understand what the problem actually is. And if someone has a skewed version in their head of what is actually going on and what's the source of it, and there's, it's a supernatural thing, or it's something just like, and like you said, it's not an African thing specifically. We have a history in the United States of, witch hunting people that are probably, a lot of them were mentally, there was a sort of mental disorder or non-neurotypical thing going on. And so it gives a really clear picture of, how scary it can be if people's understanding of something isn't there, or it's incorrect, or it's severely skewed in some manner.
Yeah, in Britain it was like the big watershed was about, I think it was 1915, was the Mental Deficiency Act, which kind of labelled a whole set of conditions which were then consequent on people being removed to long stay hospitals, which were where there was appalling treatment. And but the conditions ranged from there was one which was like the moral defective, so a lot of young women who'd had kids out of wedlock ended up in these long stay hospitals as well. So it's just a huge kind of it's a pretty terrible history which hopefully we won't ever return to.
So to take a step back before we end off, how is the process of making this film changed the way that you view your purpose in life, or maybe the meaning of life in general, which is, impossible to answer, but I feel like everything that I do, whether it's a podcast or a conversation or experience, that adds to how I walk through life a little bit, a tiny percentage, which is what I enjoy about podcasting so much. I do feel like I change in some small way in line with some of the messages that come from the people I speak to. For you, being the filmmaker, what do you think that thing is that may have changed inside you, if any, that kind of affects the way that you look at why we're all here?
Yeah, every film, I think, because I guess making a feature doc is a long process, like 2-3 years. I think this was 3 years or so from beginning to end. Well, now it's like 5 years, because it's sort of 18 months since we finished the film, and we're just releasing it in the UK now. Every one of them is its own kind of experience from the making side, where you learn, you immerse yourself in a kind of world with a set of people and around a set of kind of themes and questions. I guess for this film, I mean, often I get to the end of the film and I kind of then want to do something very different after it, as I was saying at the beginning. But I think actually with this film, interestingly, there's a whole set of things which I would love to continue to pursue. And, I sort of feel that particularly the writing of non-speaking autistic people really changes the way I look at the world. I think I look at it much more as I'm much more aware of my own your own take on the world is a very particular one. It's particular in a sensory way. We probably none of us have precisely the same sensory experience. Everyone's idea of what a particular color is probably largely different. We all see the world in slightly different ways, and that makes you think a lot about the judgments you make about other people, the ways you communicate with them, or the ways you think they're communicating with you. I think that's probably the biggest way it's affected me.
Yeah, that's definitely been a huge part of my journey as well. Going through life is just getting my worldview blown to pieces and then collecting it and looking at the world in hopefully a little bit of a better way and a more accurate lens, and realizing how much of my own experience does not necessarily carry over to how other people see things, and it's not necessarily better or worse, it's just different.
Yeah, absolutely.
So where can people check out the film? What's the best spot for people to watch The Reason I Jump?
In the States, as of yesterday, the film is on Netflix, so that's
really
exciting. Yeah.
Wow.
It's
amazing.
Also available as a Blu-ray, when the Blu-ray has the full 360 Atmos mix, so if you've got kind of the means of playing that at home, that's a good way to experience the film. And there's a DVD, both available from Kino Lorber. In the UK, on Friday, it's released in cinemas, and it's in about 60 cinemas around the UK. ReasonIJump.film is the website. If you want kind of more background material on the film, there's another website which will be there for longer and is more international, called thereasonijumpfilm.com.
Got it. Yeah, I've already seen it once, and I'm excited to check it out again. And now that it's on Netflix, I can watch it, as many times as I want. So that's brilliant. That's great. Definitely go check out the film. I actually have the trailer here that I can play live on the podcast. So for those of you who are watching, you'll see this play towards the end, and I'll link all the places that Jerry mentioned to go check out the film. And if you're listening, you can follow along with the audio of the trailer. So I'll play this now.
Can you imagine how your life would be if you couldn't say what you wanted?
Naoki Higashida makes a map of his mind. It's kind of poetry.
How do I see the world? For me, the details jump straight out. Inside my head, there isn't really such a big difference between what I was told just now and what I heard a long time ago. My mind is forever swaying this way and that.
I've tried to stop her from being herself.
I think we can change the conversation around autism by being part of the conversation.
Right now, Joss is having a joy that I will never come close to.
To live my life as a human being, nothing is more important than being able to express myself.